People laughed when Oliver Pendleton started packing wet dirt against the interior of his cabin walls. They called him a cheapskate, an eccentric old fool losing his grip on reality. But when the historic deep freeze hit, silencing the power grid, those same mocking neighbors faced a terrifying, deadly reckoning. Blackwood Ridge, Montana, was a place where people prided themselves on being prepared. But in the late autumn of 2025, the definition of prepared heavily depended on your tax bracket. The valley had recently seen an influx of wealthy out-of-towners building sprawling, modern architectural marvels. Among them were Greg and Brenda Jenkins, a couple in their early 40s who had just completed a sleek, matte black smart farmhouse overlooking the valley. Their home was a fortress of closed-cell spray foam, triple-pane, argon-filled windows, and a hyper-efficient, app-controlled HVAC system. Just a quarter-mile down the gravel road lived Oliver Pendleton. At 68, Oliver was a retired structural engineer who had chosen a quieter life after his wife passed away. He lived in a modest, 30-year-old timber frame cabin. His pension was fixed, his needs were simple, and his understanding of thermodynamics was unparalleled. The Farmer's Almanac and early meteorological models were predicting a winter unlike any seen in a century. A massive disruption in the polar vortex was threatening to send a lobe of Arctic air straight down the spine of the Rocky Mountains, stalling over Montana. Oliver didn't trust the fragile state of the local electrical grid to withstand a prolonged, brutal freeze. He knew his aging cabin's fiberglass insulation wouldn't be enough. He also knew he couldn't afford a $30,000 retrofit. So, Oliver turned to the earth. He decided to build an interior secondary wall system using a modified rammed earth and cob technique. By mixing local clay-heavy subsoil, sharp sand, pumice, and straw, he began constructing 2-foot-thick walls inside his living room, wrapping around his heavy cast-iron wood stove. The spectacle provided endless entertainment for the residents of Blackwood Ridge. "Hey Artie, building a giant litter box in there?" shouted Bill McAllister, the local general contractor who had built Greg Jenkins' smart home. Mac had pulled his heavy-duty pickup to the edge of Oliver's driveway, leaning out the window with a smirk. "I can get you a deal on fiberglass, you know. You don't have to live in a mud hut like a caveman." Oliver paused, resting his forearms on his wooden tamper. His boots were caked in reddish-brown clay. "Fiberglass resists heat flow, Mac. It doesn't store it," Oliver replied calmly, wiping sweat from his brow. "This dirt is thermal mass. Once my stove heats it up, it'll radiate warmth for days, even if the fire goes out." Mac scoffed, shaking his head. "Whatever you say, buddy. Just don't invite me over when the walls dissolve into a puddle." The mocking didn't stop with Mac. Greg Jenkins found Oliver's project particularly hilarious. Greg loved to boast about his home's R-value and his backup propane generator, which was wired to an automatic transfer switch. One afternoon, while Oliver was hauling buckets of wet mix from his wheelbarrow, Greg strolled over, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. "Oliver, honestly, you're hurting the property values," Greg chuckled, adjusting his Patagonia fleece. "Brenda thinks you've lost your mind. If you need a loan for a proper heat pump, just ask. This whole dirt thing. It's pathetic. You're building a tomb of cold mud." "Dirt is only cold if you don't heat it, Greg," Oliver said, dumping a heavy bucket of cob into the wooden slipform and grabbing his tamping tool. Thud. 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 It's physics. When the grid goes down, your smart home is going to be incredibly stupid. Greg laughed out loud. "The grid isn't going down, Oliver. And even if it does, my generator kicks in automatically. My thermostat is connected to satellites. I think I'll be fine." By late November, Oliver had finished. The interior of his cabin looked radically different. The thick, earthen walls had dried to a warm, sandy beige. They were surprisingly smooth and aesthetically pleasing, curving organically around the space. More importantly, they were dense. Thousands of pounds of earth now surrounded his central living area. For 2 weeks, Oliver ran his wood stove constantly, effectively charging the thermal battery. The dirt absorbed the intense heat, storing it deep within its core. The neighbors continued their jokes at Miller's Hardware down in town, dubbing Oliver's cabin the Mud Pie Mansion. They boasted about their heated driveways, their Wi-Fi-enabled pellet stoves, and their impenetrable spray foam. Then, the second week of December arrived, and the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The Weather Service called it the Siberian Express, but the locals would later just call it the Great White Death. It didn't just snow. The atmosphere itself seemed to shatter. The temperature plummeted from a mild 20 degrees Fahrenheit to a staggering -38, -39 degrees Celsius, in a matter of 6 hours. The wind howled at 60 miles per hour, driving fine, needle-like ice horizontally across the valley. Inside his smart home, Greg Jenkins sat on his leather sofa, tapping his tablet. The wind was a dull roar outside the triple-pane glass. The house was a balmy 72 degrees. "Look at this," Greg said to Brenda, pointing at his screen. "Outside, it's -35. Inside, perfection. The heat pump is working overtime, but the foam is holding it all in." "What about the power lines?" Brenda asked, looking nervously out the massive floor-to-ceiling aesthetic windows at the bending pine trees. "The wind is terrifying." "We have the generator," Greg said smoothly. "We are untouchable." 2 miles down the road, at the Main Valley substation, a 50-year-old transformer, brittle from the extreme, sudden temperature drop, and battered by ice loading, catastrophically failed. A brilliant flash of blue-green light arced into the night sky, followed by a concussive boom that echoed over the howling wind. Instantly, the entire Blackwood Ridge Valley was plunged into darkness. Greg's tablet flashed an error message. The lights in the smart farmhouse died. The low hum of the HVAC system spun down into an eerie silence. "It's fine," Greg said, standing up. "Generator will kick on in 10 seconds. 10 seconds passed. Then 30. Then a minute. Greg marched into his utility room and opened the electrical panel, shining his phone's flashlight. He pressed the manual override for the generator. Nothing happened. Panic began to prickle at the back of his neck. He bundled up in a heavy coat and forced the side door open against the raging wind, fighting his way to the aluminum enclosure of his expensive backup generator. He ripped the access panel off. The generator hadn't started. The high-tech, computer-controlled fuel injection system, the very thing that made it so efficient, had a fatal flaw. In the rapid, extreme drop in temperature, microscopic condensation inside the electronic fuel regulator had flash frozen, expanding and cracking the delicate sensor. The generator's computer was throwing a safety fault, refusing to crank the engine. Greg's $15,000 backup plan was a useless block of freezing metal. Back inside, the reality of spray foam insulation was about to reveal its dark side. Spray foam is phenomenal at trapping air. It creates an airtight seal, but without an active heat source to replace the heat lost through the massive, beautiful windows Greg had insisted on, the house began to cool. Fast. And because it was airtight, as the temperature dropped, the moisture from Greg and Brenda's breath had nowhere to go. Frost began to form on the inside of the window frames within 2 hours. Across the valley, Mac McAllister was facing a different nightmare. He relied on heavy-duty propane heaters. But propane has a boiling point of -44 degrees. At -38, with the wind chill plunging the effective temperature of the steel tanks to -60. The liquid propane inside his exterior tanks was becoming sluggish, refusing to vaporize efficiently. Furthermore, Mac had skimped on insulating his copper gas lines. The regulators at the tanks froze solid. His heaters sputtered, coughed, and died. By 3:00 a.m., the temperature inside Greg's sleek modern home had dropped to 35 degrees and was still falling. Brenda was crying, wrapped in 3 duvets on the couch. Their breath plumed in the air. "Call someone." Brenda shivered violently. "Cell towers are down. The Wi-Fi is dead," Greg yelled, his own teeth chattering. "The smart locks are frozen. The condensation froze the mechanisms. We're trapped in here." Meanwhile, inside the Mudpie mansion, Oliver Pendleton was sitting in his worn armchair, reading a paperback novel by the light of an oil lamp. He wasn't wearing a heavy coat. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans. The fire in his cast-iron stove had actually burned down to mere embers hours ago. He hadn't bothered to restock it. He didn't need to. The 2-foot-thick walls of rammed earth surrounding him had absorbed millions of BTUs of heat over the past 2 weeks. Now, with the ambient air temperature in the cabin trying to drop, the massive earthen battery was doing exactly what Oliver designed it to do. It was slowly, steadily radiating that trapped heat back into the room. The dirt walls were literally warm to the touch. The cabin was hovering at a comfortable, stable 64 degrees. The thick earth also acted as incredible acoustic insulation. The raging blizzard outside sounded like a distant, muffled whisper. Oliver closed his book, took a sip of lukewarm tea, and stood up to check the embers. He felt a deep sense of peace. He had outsmarted the deadly freeze, not with silicon chips and lithium batteries, but with dirt. Suddenly, a sound cut through the muffled roar of the storm. Bang, bang, bang. It was weak, desperate, and coming from his heavy wooden front door. Oliver grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the entryway. He unbolted the door and pulled it open, a blast of freezing, blinding white snow, immediately invading his sanctuary. Standing on his porch, covered head to toe in a crust of ice, looking like half-dead ghosts, were Greg and Brenda Jenkins. Oliver. Greg choked out, his voice a ragged, freezing rasp, his previous arrogance entirely gone. Oliver, please, we're dying. Oliver didn't hesitate. He grabbed Greg by the shoulder of his frozen, rigid parka and hauled him inside. Brenda stumbled in right behind him, her lips a terrifying shade of cyan, her eyes glazed and unfocused. As Oliver slammed the heavy oak door shut against the howling vortex, the sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. The contrast between the brutal -38 degrees outside and the radiant 64 degrees inside hit Greg and Brenda like a physical wall. Brenda collapsed to her knees on the braided rug, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers. She was experiencing the classic umbles of moderate hypothermia: stumbles, mumbles, and fumbles. "Get those wet outer layers off, right now," Oliver commanded, his voice carrying the calm, authoritative tone of a man who had spent decades managing high-stress engineering sites. He didn't wait for them to comply. He knelt beside Brenda, struggling with the frozen zipper of her expensive North Face down coat. The zipper pull snapped off in his fingers, brittle from the cold. He grabbed a pair of heavy canvas shears from his workbench and expertly snipped the bottom of the zipper track, pulling the coat apart. My house," Greg stammered, his teeth clicking together so violently it sounded like castanets. He clumsily peeled off his icy gloves, revealing fingers that were stark, white, and stiff. "The generator, it died, Oliver. The computer faulted out. Condensation in the injection lines, I imagine," Oliver said softly, wrapping a thick, wool Pendleton blanket around Brenda's shoulders. "When the temperature drops that fast, modern electronics get confused. Condensation freezes, cracks the sensors, and the microchips tell the engine it's too dangerous to run. A safety feature that kills you." Oliver moved to his cast-iron Vermont Castings wood stove. He opened the damper, tossed in some crumpled newspaper and a few pieces of dry cedar kindling, and blew on the glowing embers. Within seconds, a cheerful, crackling flame erupted. He didn't want to overheat the room. Warming hypothermia victims too rapidly can cause cold blood from the extremities to rush back to the heart, triggering cardiac arrest. He needed slow, ambient warmth. "You built a tomb of mud, you said," Greg whispered, staring at the curved earthen walls glowing warmly in the firelight. He reached out a trembling hand and pressed it against the dirt. His eyes widened. It's actually warm. The wall itself is warm." "Thermal mass, Greg," Oliver replied, placing a vintage blue enamel Coleman kettle on top of the stove to heat up some water. "These walls weigh nearly 14,000 pounds. They've been soaking up heat from this stove for 2 weeks. Outside, your spray foam is just a hollow shell trying to keep cold air out. In here, the earth is actively fighting back, radiating heat from within." Brenda began to cry, a weak, pathetic sound. "We were going to die in our living room, our $3 million house, and we were freezing to death on our Italian leather sofa." Oliver handed Greg a mug of lukewarm, sugary tea. "Drink this slowly. Don't gulp. The sugar will help your body generate its own heat." As Greg took a sip, color slowly returning to his pale cheeks, a sudden, horrifying realization washed over his face. He slammed the mug down on the wooden table, spilling the tea. "Oliver. Mac." Greg gasped, panic rising in his throat. Oliver stopped tending the fire and turned around. "Bill McAllister? What about him?" "He texted me right before the cell towers went down," Greg said, his voice rising in pitch. His propane tanks froze up. The liquid wouldn't vaporize. His heaters are dead. And Oliver, Sarah just had the baby. Little Leo is only 3 weeks old. The warm, safe atmosphere in the cabin suddenly vanished, replaced by a suffocating dread. Mac's house was a half-mile away, situated at the top of a steep, exposed ridge. If Greg's highly insulated house had dropped to freezing in hours, Mac's sprawling, drafty log home built more for rustic aesthetics than thermal efficiency would be a cryogenic chamber by now. A newborn infant wouldn't survive the night in those temperatures. "We have to call emergency services," Brenda pleaded, clutching the wool blanket tighter. "There are no emergency services tonight, Brenda," Oliver said grimly, walking toward a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room. "The roads are under 3 feet of drifting snow. The plows won't run in a ground blizzard with 0 visibility. Helicopters can't fly in 60-mile-per-hour crosswind. We are entirely on our own." Oliver opened the chest and pulled out a pair of traditional wooden snowshoes with rawhide webbing, followed by a heavy canvas rucksack and a coil of high-visibility climbing rope. "What are you doing?" Greg asked, staggering to his feet. "I'm going to get them," Oliver said, pulling on a thick pair of Carhartt insulated bib overalls. "I have a plastic polk sled in the woodshed. I can haul them back here." "You're 68 years old, Oliver. You'll die out there," Greg yelled. "I'll go. Let me borrow your gear." Oliver looked at Greg. The younger man was still shivering, his core temperature critically low. His reflexes were shot. "Greg, you wouldn't make it to the end of my driveway. Your body is severely compromised. Sit down by the stove. Keep your wife warm." "Oliver, please," Greg begged, tears welling in his eyes, the guilt of his previous arrogance crushing him. "I mocked you. We all did. You don't owe us anything. You definitely don't owe Mac anything." Oliver zipped up his heavy canvas coat and pulled a wool balaclava over his head, leaving only his eyes exposed. He strapped a high-powered LED headlamp to his forehead. "Survival isn't about holding grudges, Greg," Oliver said, his voice muffled through the wool. "It's about engineering a solution to a problem. And right now, the problem is a baby freezing to death on that ridge. Keep this fire burning low and steady. If I'm not back in 2 hours, well, there's plenty of canned soup in the pantry." With that, Oliver stepped back out into the roaring white abyss, pulling the door shut behind him. The wind hit Oliver like a physical blow, instantly stealing his breath and blinding him with a barrage of ice crystals. The temperature had plummeted even further. The weather station down in the valley would later record a terrifying -42 degrees, -41 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, exposed skin-free, he stepped onto the snowshoes and began the agonizing trek up the ridge. Every step was a battle against the elements. The wind roared like a freight train, a deafening, continuous scream that made it impossible to think. The snowdrifts were waist-deep in places, requiring Oliver to use every ounce of his remaining strength to lift his legs and drag the heavy sled behind him. The beam of his headlamp barely penetrated the swirling whiteout, reflecting back off the snow and creating a disorienting, hypnotic effect. He navigated by memory and the subtle slope of the terrain, feeling his way toward Mac's property. His lungs burned with every inhalation of the frigid, razor-sharp air. Frost quickly accumulated on his eyelashes, threatening to freeze his eyes shut. After 45 agonizing minutes, a dark, looming shape appeared in the whiteout. It was Mac's massive Ford F-250 pickup, buried up to its windows in snow. Beyond it stood the dark silhouette of the contractor's dream home. Oliver unclipped from the sled and pounded heavily on the front door. There was no answer. He tried the handle. It was locked. He didn't have time for pleasantries. He retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from the sled, wedged it into the doorframe, and threw his weight against it. The frozen wood splintered, and the door burst open. A thick, acrid cloud of black smoke billowed out of the entryway, causing Oliver to cough violently. "Mac!" Oliver roared over the wind. He pushed his way inside, shining his headlamp through the toxic haze. The inside of the house was freezing, the air thick with soot. In the center of the sunken living room, Mac was frantically tearing apart a custom mahogany dining chair, feeding the polished wood into a decorative, unvented gas fireplace. Sarah was huddled on the floor, mere inches from the pathetic flames, clutching a bundle of blankets tightly to her chest. She was weeping silently, her face covered in black soot. "Mac, stop!" Oliver yelled, rushing over. "You're carbon monoxide poisoning yourselves. That flue isn't drawing in this wind." Mac looked up, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Oliver? What are you doing here?" "My heaters. The propane. It won't burn." "I know," Oliver said, grabbing Mac by the collar and pulling him away from the smoking fire. "Grab your warmest blankets. We're leaving. Now. Before you suffocate or freeze." "The baby," Sarah sobbed, her voice incredibly weak. "Oliver, he's so cold. He stopped crying an hour ago." Oliver's heart hammered against his ribs. He knelt beside Sarah and peeled back the layers of blankets. Little Leo was incredibly pale, his tiny lips tinged blue. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow and irregular. "Put him in the sled." "We don't have a second to lose," Oliver commanded. He helped Mac bundle Sarah and the infant into a heavy sleeping bag, then guided them out into the blizzard and laid them carefully into the plastic pulk sled. He threw a thermal mylar blanket over the top to block the wind and strapped them down. Mac, practically delirious from the cold and smoke inhalation, stumbled behind them, clinging to a rope Oliver tied to the back of the sled. The journey back was a nightmare of endurance. The wind was directly in their faces now. Oliver's muscles screamed in protest. Every muscle fiber in his legs burned with lactic acid. He fell twice, plunging face first into the drifts. But the thought of the silent baby in the sled forced him back to his feet. He became a machine, putting one snowshoe in front of the other, leaning into the harness, dragging the weight of 3 lives behind him. When they finally crashed through the door of the mud pie mansion, they looked like an expedition returning from the summit of Everest. Greg and Brenda rushed forward, helping Mac inside and untying the sled. Oliver collapsed onto his knees, ripping off his balaclava and gasping for air. His beard was a solid block of ice. "The baby!" Brenda cried, unzipping the sleeping bag. She lifted the tiny bundle out. Sarah collapsed onto the sofa, unable to stand. Brenda and Greg rushed the baby toward the warm, radiating dirt wall, keeping him a safe distance from the stove, but firmly within the envelope of the thermal mass. Oliver slowly pulled himself up. The cabin was now holding 6 people. The ambient temperature had dropped to 58 degrees due to the door being open, and 6 cold bodies were rapidly absorbing the heat. "The dirt," Mac coughed, staring at the walls in a daze as he slumped onto the floor. It's doing it. It's keeping us alive." "It's a buffer," Oliver rasped, his throat raw. "But with 6 of us in here, the moisture from our breath is going to become a problem. Fortunately, unsealed earthen walls are hygroscopic. They absorb excess humidity from the air and release it when it's dry. Your smart homes trap that moisture, turning into an icebox. This mud breathes." But Oliver knew the thermal battery was draining faster now. He needed to recharge the walls. He walked over to the Vermont casting stove and threw open the doors. "I need to run it hot," Oliver said. "But my indoor wood rack is empty. The main cord is outside in the shed." "I'll go," Greg said instantly. His color had returned, and his hypothermia had subsided. He looked at Oliver with fierce determination. "Show me where the gear is." For the next 48 hours, the 6 of them existed in a surreal, timeless bubble of survival. Outside, the Siberian Express raged, dropping another 3 feet of snow and maintaining sub-zero temperatures that shattered records across the Pacific Northwest. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. Transformers blew in spectacular light shows across the valley. Modern infrastructure failed catastrophically. Inside the Mud Pie Mansion, it was a crucible of cooperation. Greg braved the blizzard 4 times to haul firewood. Brenda learned to monitor the baby's temperature, cheering with tears in her eyes when little Leo finally let out a healthy, demanding wail of hunger. Mac, humbled and recovering from smoke inhalation, helped Oliver monitor the structural integrity of the walls and keep the fire stoked to the precise temperature needed to charge the thermal mass without overheating the small space. The earthen walls performed a miracle of passive engineering. When the stove roared, the walls eagerly drank the heat. When the fire died down overnight, while they slept on the floor wrapped in sleeping bags, the walls faithfully radiated that stored energy back into the room, maintaining a steady, life-saving 65 degrees. On the morning of the 3rd day, the howling wind finally died. A heavy, Absolute silence settled over Blackwood Ridge. Oliver woke up and walked to his small kitchen window. He wiped away the condensation. The sky outside was a brilliant, piercing, cloudless blue. The sun was rising over a landscape buried under a devastating ocean of white. Suddenly, a rhythmic thwack 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 echoed through the valley. A National Guard Black Hawk helicopter banked low over the ridge, its rotors kicking up a massive cloud of powder. It hovered briefly over Greg's dark, frozen mansion, then over Mac's half-buried truck, before spotting the thin, gray ribbon of wood smoke rising steadily from Oliver's chimney. Greg stood beside Oliver, looking out the window at the helicopter. He then turned and ran his hand along the smooth, sandy surface of the interior dirt wall. "They're going to write articles about this," Greg said softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "The smart homes failed, the generators died, the spray foam failed, and we were saved by a man who packed wet dirt into his living room." Mac walked up behind them, holding his crying, healthy infant son. He looked at Oliver, his eyes filled with profound respect. "I owe you my family's life, Oliver. I called you a caveman. I was the fool." Oliver smiled slightly, turning away from the window to put the blue enamel kettle back on the stove. "No fools here, Mac," Oliver said, reaching for his tea. "Just people who forgot that before we had apps and microchips, we had the Earth. And the Earth always remembers how to take care of us, if we just know how to ask." If this story of Oliver's incredible survival against the odds kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life disaster and survival stories. Have you ever relied on old-school methods when modern tech failed? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. But Oliver knew the thermal battery was draining faster now. He needed to recharge the walls. He walked over to the Vermont casting stove and threw open the doors. "I need to run it hot," Oliver said. "But my indoor wood rack is empty. The main cord is outside in the shed." "I'll go," Greg said instantly. His color had returned, and his hypothermia had subsided. He looked at Oliver with fierce determination. "Show me where the gear is." For the next 48 hours, the 6 of them existed in a surreal, timeless bubble of survival. Outside, the Siberian Express raged, dropping another 3 feet of snow and maintaining sub-zero temperatures that shattered records across the Pacific Northwest. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. Transformers blew and spectacular light shows across the valley. Modern infrastructure failed catastrophically. Inside the Mud Pie Mansion, it was a crucible of cooperation. Greg braved the blizzard 4 times to haul firewood. Brenda learned to monitor the baby's temperature, cheering with tears in her eyes when little Leo finally let out a healthy, demanding wail of hunger. Mac, humbled and recovering from smoke inhalation, helped Oliver monitor the structural integrity of the walls and keep the fire stoked to the precise temperature needed to charge the thermal mass without overheating the small space. The earthen walls performed a miracle of passive engineering. When the stove roared, the walls eagerly drank the heat. When the fire died down overnight, while they slept on the floor wrapped in sleeping bags, the walls faithfully radiated that stored energy back into the room, maintaining a steady, life-saving 65 degrees. On the morning of the 3rd day, the howling wind finally died. A heavy, absolute silence settled over Blackwood Ridge. Oliver woke up and walked to his small kitchen window. He wiped away the condensation. The sky outside was a brilliant, piercing, cloudless blue. The sun was rising over a landscape buried under a devastating ocean of white. Suddenly, a rhythmic thwack 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 echoed through the valley. A National Guard Black Hawk helicopter banked low over the ridge, its rotors kicking up a massive cloud of powder. It hovered briefly over Greg's dark, frozen mansion, then over Mac's half-buried truck, before spotting the thin, gray ribbon of wood smoke rising steadily from Oliver's chimney. Greg stood beside Oliver, looking out the window at the helicopter. He then turned and ran his hand along the smooth, sandy surface of the interior dirt wall. "They're going to write articles about this," Greg said softly, shaking his head in disbelief. "The smart homes failed, the generators died, the spray foam failed, and we were saved by a man who packed wet dirt into his living room." Mac walked up behind them, holding his crying, healthy infant son. He looked at Oliver, his eyes filled with profound respect. "I owe you my family's life, Oliver. I called you a caveman. I was the fool. Oliver smiled slightly, turning away from the window to put the blue enamel kettle back on the stove. No fools here, Mac, Oliver said, reaching for his tea. Just people who forgot that before we had apps and microchips, we had the Earth. And the Earth always remembers how to take care of us, if we just know how to ask. If this story of Oliver's incredible survival against the odds kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life disaster and survival stories. Have you ever relied on old-school methods when modern tech failed? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload.